Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here this morning, and thank all of you for braving snow and shutdowns and various other things to be here today. And it's also just to acknowledge what a pleasure it's been to be part of this organizing committee and all the incredible support that the Secretary of Staff of the Academies have given to prepare us for today. I had a very funny moment on the way in this morning because I was on the train and Audrey and team from the Academy sort of sent me one of the speakers from session 1, Keith Martin, sent me his talk. And I had a bit of panic because we were definitely covering a bunch of the same ground. But in many ways, that's a good thing. It reinforces the idea that what we're talking about as part of this workshop has not only domestic implications, but profound global implications as well. So you will see some reinforcing between the two of us. Okay, no, I didn't actually, oh, there we go. So I really like this quote. I actually, for another Academy's event, actually a workshop around One Health, I found this quote a couple of years ago, and it's from a Pakistani writer, and it says, "Pull a thread here, and you'll find that it's attached to the rest of the world," and it's by Nadim Aslam. And really, we know this, right? We live in an incredibly interconnected world. And I, who spent most of my career in infectious disease, I have mostly thought about that interconnectedness as how infectious diseases can travel around the planet. But over recent years, I've become more and more interested in the topic of this workshop, which is not just the interconnectedness of people and the infectious diseases that can be transmitted, but that interplay between environment and human disease, infectious disease. So the context in which we're operating is fascinating, right? We have a world population today of 7.4 billion. This shows proportionally where people are. And this is what the planet might look like in 2050 with more than 9 billion of us on the planet. That's a profound shaper in the way that we interact with each other and with the planet. It is going to profoundly change the course of human history and also the diseases that affect humans and the effect that we have on the environment. And when you look at the big context factors that are out there, one that I'm just emerging from 3 years of living in Asia where we have huge numbers of migrant and mobile people, but we obviously have those issues here in the Americas as well. And so the flow of people around the planet is one of those factors. Climate change, of course. I actually felt a little bit like this morning walking out of Judiciary Square on the ice. But climate change, despite those skeptics, it's happening. Whether or not they will choose to acknowledge it, it is certainly happening. Urbanization, increasingly, we used to think of the hardest to reach populations on Earth as being the most rural. Now some of those hardest to reach populations are in the middle of giant cities. And the built environment is profoundly changing the course of history. Mega infrastructure projects. I spent most of my career working on malaria, so mega infrastructure projects are very interesting to me because they change the way water and humans come into contact. Globalization, meat distribution is just an example. I'm not going to walk you through the sort of details of this slide, but you can just see this sort of looks at how meat gets into a multinational fast food company and where it comes from. And at the end of the day, our food supply is so global. And that's not just, we think of that as, again, I have to be honest, I've often thought of that as an infectious disease threat. But there are all sorts of other things that get into our food supply, all sorts of pollutants, toxicants that get into our supply. And figuring out where those have come from has become an increasingly complex exercise. The next slide, I went to give this talk again for a committee that Audrey is in charge of around a One Health Fellowship, and I was looking for a slide that just shows how humans and animals might come into contact. And this is the horrific slide I came up with, and this is a slaughterhouse in Cambodia. Except I happen to be living in Cambodia, and I know just where this slaughterhouse is, and it was right next to my kid's school. So this is the way humans and animals come into contact. It doesn't take a lot of sort of imagination to think of what that might mean for the people working in that sort of environment and what that means for the flow of certainly of infectious diseases between humans and animals. Environmental pollution. I know this is going to be a big thing we talk about today, but this is something that's affecting, I think we're going to talk a lot about in the context of this workshop, and not just the effect it has on the environment, but the effect it has on people, and this interplay that we're going to talk about how this may impact on the way humans respond to infectious diseases. And then environmental contaminants, and we're going to talk about some of these today. Mercury, arsenic, PFAS are just three, and those are ones that we're going to touch upon. Despite all of this obvious push around interconnectedness, our responses remain remarkably siloed. You've got the people working on animal health, and veterinarians, and people working on vectors. Then you have the humans. I'm a pediatrician, so I've been in that middle silo for much of my career, and folks on the environmental side. And it's really a bit amazing that it has taken us so long. So what can we do about that? There are three helpful, and I call them helpful and holistic approaches. We get caught up a lot sometimes in the differences between these, and I want to argue that we should focus less on the differences and more that here are three great paradigms that bring together ways of thinking that are multidisciplinary, and I'll get to that in a minute, the interdisciplinary nature of these. But I think all of these present opportunities for us to get out of our lanes and think, I, for one, have spent the last few years thinking about One Health as a frame. It could have been the others. But what that has done is brought me into contact with veterinarians, thinking about it from the animal perspective, in contact with people from the environmental health community and thinking what that means. In the middle of Cambodia, seeing a wildlife die-off and humans getting sick and discovering that there's an interplay where watering holes were being poisoned with pesticides as a way of getting animals to die, so then people were eating the animals and those toxicants were getting into people. And so I've been out at the sort of the cold face of this, seeing the way really this plays out in the most marginalized populations in the world. And this is for laughs. So you remember the guy in the first photo? It looks sort of like me, I've discovered, but that's actually me when I actually had a lot of hair. And little did I know when I sort of started my career, this is 1990, it's Fortaleza, Brazil. I'm working on an ice cider grant, looking at household epidemiology of Cryptosporidium and environmental sources of Cryptosporidium. And that's a water pump that I brought in my luggage to Brazil, and trying to filter and look for Cryptosporidium oocysts in the water supplies of this favela in northeast Brazil. One Health, the term didn't even exist back then, but in many ways, my entire career has been at this interface. It's just that back then, we didn't really have a name for it. So the other thing that I would make a plea for is to sort of revisit outdated paradigms. And the example for me is non-communicable diseases. This word drives me crazy, right? Because if you think about it, from a health systems perspective, it matters very little whether a disease is communicable or non-communicable. It really matters whether something is acute or chronic, right? In Cambodia, for instance, there's a rising tide of diabetes and hypertension, but there's no system to deliver care to those people on a chronic basis. But in many countries, there's a fantastic system to deliver HIV medicines. So how are we going to think from the human health perspective about how to bring those two different streams, communicable and non-communicable, together? The other thing is many non-communicable diseases, as we well know, and we'll discuss to some extent during this workshop, have as their origins, some non-communicable diseases have underlying infectious disease triggers, and as we're going to discuss, the other way around. So that interplay, but I think one of our jobs is to challenge paradigms. If the term non-communicable diseases is making us stick in silos, then let's become a bunch of ambassadors to go out there and bust down those silos and say, that is an outdated term that isn't helping anything in terms of bringing scientists and program implementers around the world together to think how we can do things differently. We need to better collect and analyze surveillance data to improve our understanding of the interplay, right? So there's a lot of data out there. But again, what I see is that we collect those data and people sort of look at the piece of the data that they expect or want to look at, and they don't look across in the way that I think that we could gain a lot of increased understanding, not just sort of for the sake of sort of publishing a paper about those surveillance data, but for really driving this cycle. So, if we have data, it can point the way up in the upper left. Let's say we have data, surveillance data, monitoring and evaluation data. That should point our way to what programmatically relevant research we could conduct. From that programmatically relevant research, we can think about what's the sort of policy change that we want to affect.
policy change, it's great to have a policy, but it only matters if we turn it into a program, as we need to implement those programs. And then we need to make sure that there's good surveillance data, monitoring and evaluation to look at those programs and see if we're making a difference and drive what the next research question is. I actually sketched this on a whiteboard probably a dozen years ago now, but I still feel that idea that we need to work around that cycle, and no matter where we fit in that cycle, speak around that whole cycle and how we help to drive it. We need to aspire and act globally. So when I first started as chair of this workshop committee, I launched into the Sustainable Development Goals and was met with a stony silence. But for me and where I sit in the world, these are the driving force out there. These 17 goals, the global goals for sustainable development, everyone calls them the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals, are an incredibly ambitious agenda for humankind and for the planet. Many people have thrown stones at them and said, well, there's too many, they're too complicated. Yes and yes, there are too many, they are too complicated. But if we could actually achieve these goals, the planet would be a vastly different and better place, not just for humans, but for animals and for the planet itself. They're tremendously powerful because they cross so many disciplines. They're tremendously powerful because number 17 is around partnership. And this meeting is about partnership. We can't do this if we're staying in our own lanes. We can only do it if we work across disciplines and across fields. I'm just going to give a few examples. This comes from a data hub that was designed by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Washington. And this is, I was actually doing I was doing a talk and then a paper about SDG 3, which is around health. The green indicators are in the indicators for health. All of the others are health-related, but fall into other SDGs. And the reason I show that is you could do the same exercise with any of the SDGs. You can't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for health unless you're thinking outside of health. And the same can be said for each of those. Each of those cross-pollinate in ways where we have to make sure that we're thinking outside of our usual lanes. And I give these examples that are not the green ones for health, but these are ones that are in other lanes and are very relevant to this meeting. So one of the health-related SDGs is a risk-weighted prevalence of population using unsafe or improved sanitation. There's clearly an environmental factor. Risk-weighted prevalence of household air pollution. We're going to talk a lot about air pollution in the context of this meeting. Here's an age-standardized, all-cause, disability-adjusted life year rates attributable to occupational risks. So how do people and the environment and where they work interface? I just give these examples, but I could go on and on. We can't achieve the SDGs for human health if we just think about human health in one lane in a box. So what are we really here today to do is to think about interplay. And I don't even know who to give credit to. I'm sure it was one of the fantastic secretariat team who came up with the idea of using the word interplay. But there's different ways that we think about interplay. There's multidisciplinary, which draws on knowledge from different disciplines but stays within boundaries. That at least is a step in the right direction. There's interdisciplinary, which analyzes, synthesizes, and harmonizes links between disciplines into a coordinated and coherent whole. And the holy grail, transdisciplinary, which integrates natural, social, and health sciences in a humanities context and transcends traditional boundaries. And that's really what we would ultimately like to do, is really work in a way that we really are thinking outside of our usual lanes, working across disciplines, and thinking how do we advance science and how do we advance the implementation of that science to make the world a better place. And I'll finish with this slide because I love it, and I finish many of my talks with this, which is the best time to plant, this is a Chinese proverb, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. Clearly, this is work that we should have been doing a long time ago to build bridges between environmental health, thinking about the environment and animals and people together. But if we didn't start 20 years ago, then getting a jump start today is certainly the next best option. So thank you very much, and thank you for attending this workshop.